Hi, I'm Dr. Felice Gersh, your integrative OBGYN physician. In this program, we're going to talk about the differences between a woman's heart and a man's heart, and we'll cover a little bit more about the cardiovascular system, and of course, focus a bit on menopause. Well, who has pregnancies? Of course, women do. So to accommodate the demands of pregnancy, women have to have a more energetic heart, because when a woman is pregnant, she has to pump over 50% more blood volume around her body to support the placenta and the fetus. So to that end, you have to have a more energetic heart. Well, how does that happen? Do women have more mitochondria, the little energy producing organelles? Actually, they don't. They simply have the capacity to create more energy from the same mitochondria. But in order to accomplish that, to create the energy, you need estradiol. Estradiol, the estrogen that's produced also by the placenta, but by the ovaries as well. That's the dominant estrogen of the ovaries, but it's also produced along with estriol in large quantities in pregnancy. So we have these little structures in every structure of the body, every organ, and in the heart we have lots of them called mitochondria. So these little structures, these little organelles that are in cells create energy. Now, what does estradiol do with the mitochondria to create the energy in the heart? Well, they actually literally create the energy that's called ATP by facilitating the electron transport chain. Now, when you create energy, there is waste products that are also produced. Now, the waste product is called superoxide. It's two oxygen molecules hooked together. Superoxide is very toxic and will kill the mitochondria and therefore the cell, the myocyte, the muscle cell of the heart. So we don't want that to happen. So we have an enzyme that's in the heart muscle cells, and it is called manganese superoxide dismutase. Now, to facilitate the function of this enzyme, guess what? You need estradiol. So that is really important so that you don't create a dead mitochondria in a dead cell. Now, what happens with that enzyme is it converts the superoxide to hydrogen peroxide, which is also toxic. But unlike superoxide, hydrogen peroxide can move out of the mitochondria into the cell where it is converted into harmless water. So you need estradiol to facilitate the creation of energy and to get rid of the toxic waste product produced by the production of energy. Now, you want to have mitochondria that are long-lived, that are rejuvenating themselves. That's called mitophagy. Mitophagy requires a certain enzyme. It's in the family of what are called sirtuins, histone deacetylases, they're called. And the one in the mitochondria is called sirtuin. We abbreviate it SIRT, S-I-R-T, 3. In order for this enzyme to work properly, guess what you need? Estradiol. So when you have plenty of estradiol because the ovaries are working well, or you're in a pregnancy that the placenta is making the estrogen that's necessary, you have a well-functioning, strong heart that's making all this energy. Now, additionally, interestingly, there are products that are called ligands. Ligand is something that binds to a receptor. Now, these ligands, we don't know what they are, but they create energy in the heart, and they don't work. They don't bind unless you have estradiol right there in the neighborhood. So they call them estrogen-related receptors. The receptors are what the ligand fits into. If you think of the receptor like the lock and the ligand like the key. So these ligands will not lock into the receptor unless estradiol is there too. So that's why I said they call them estrogen-related receptors. And these help to do all kinds of things like make energy. Now, another interesting thing is there's a metabolite of estradiol. It's made in the liver from estradiol. It's converted into this new product called 2-methoxyestradiol. Well, it turns out that 2-methoxyestradiol is also critically important for the creation of energy. And it's felt that it does this through a process where they call it hormesis, like a little bit creates a little bit of damage, and then the mitochondria become more functional. So you need to have estradiol in its own right, to work in the mitochondria to create energy for the heart. And additionally, you need it in terms of its presence so that you have the estrogen-related receptors that will work. And you need to have it properly metabolized into 2-methoxyestradiol so that it too, which has its own receptors in the heart, isn't that amazing? Its own separate receptors to create more functionality, the mitochondria, and more energy. So that's why when women are pregnant and they do not have a healthy body, they do not have a good developing placenta, and they don't have everything right with their heart, they are more prone to having heart failure. Well, what about in menopause? It turns out that women in menopause have a special problem that happens in some that's called diastolic dysfunction. So this is what happens when a heart pumps. It contracts and out comes the blood. The blood coming out of the heart is called the ejection fraction. Now, when the heart is contracting, that is when in the arteries, the blood is now filling the arteries, increasing blood pressure. So that's called the systolic phase. Like if you have a blood pressure 120/80, the top number is the systolic. It's the higher pressure when the heart is pumping out the blood, and the lower number is the diastolic when the heart isn't pumping and the pressure in the arteries drops because there's no blood flowing into them at that moment. So we talk about that in terms of the heart. When the heart contracts and the blood comes out, and I said that's the ejection fraction, the amount of blood coming out, that's the systolic, and that's when the blood pressure is higher. And the diastolic is when the heart reopens and refills. And then that is called diastolic, and that matches up to when the blood pressure is lower, the diastolic blood pressure. Well, think of it this way. If you're doing a squat, which is actually harder, going down or coming up? Well, it's easier to go down than to come up. So the heart, when it opens and refills, takes a tremendous amount of energy. And in menopause, I've already now told you how the heart needs lots of estrogen, lots of estradiol to maintain this energy production in the heart. Well, in menopause, you're not going to have that because the ovaries are not making estrogen any longer, and you don't have enough estrogen coming from other tissues to make up for the difference. So the heart will often have an energy deficient state, and that will manifest as diastolic dysfunction, that the heart has enough energy to contract and the blood coming out is a totally normal amount, but it doesn't have enough energy to reopen and then refill with the blood during the diastolic phase. You can see this on an ultrasound of the heart called an echocardiogram, and it is seen that the heart looks stiffer. So instead of opening nicely, it's stiffer, okay? And you can see it on the echocardiogram, and so a cardiologist who's reading it will report mild diastolic dysfunction. That is not an insignificant finding. It truly means that you have a heart that is deficient in energy. So that is really a big deal. And I'm going to tell you something else that it implies as well in a minute. Now, over time, in some women, they develop a special kind of heart failure that can happen in men, but is much less common. It's much more common in women. It's called heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. That means the amount of blood coming out of the heart when the heart contracts is normal, but the heart cannot function properly, so it goes into heart failure because it cannot open properly to refill. And that can then progress into a global heart failure and can be debilitating and even cause mortality. So that's one reason why I always recommend to my menopausal women to have an ultrasound, an echocardiogram of their heart to assess the status of the energy of their heart. Now, additionally, it turns out that the heart and the arteries need a special gas called nitric oxide. Now, nitric oxide has many functions. It acts almost like a hormone. It's a signaling agent. And in the arteries, it keeps the arteries dilated. It maintains the health of the lining of the arteries called the intima. And it helps prevent abnormal blood clotting. It keeps platelets from clumping and creating inappropriate blood clots. So it's really, really important. And how do we make nitric oxide, this fleeting gas, how do we make it in arteries and in our heart? So there's two kinds that are the ones that we want all the time activated. That's endothelial nitric oxide synthase is the enzyme that makes one nitric oxide that is in arteries and elsewhere, and another version of that enzyme, nitric oxide synthase, is neuronal nitric oxide synthase. And both of these are found in the heart and in the arteries, and they make nitric oxide. In order for this special enzyme to work, you need estradiol. So where are you going to get the estradiol from? Well, either from your ovaries or from getting it as a prescription medication. Now, what about men? Do men make nitric oxide? Yes, they do. They make it in their arteries. And how do they? Because they don't have a lot of estradiol. They convert testosterone into estradiol in their arteries and heart. There's actually the enzyme aromatase that converts testosterone into estradiol. But women don't do that well, and they don't have enough testosterone to make enough, and their arteries and hearts are really not designed that way. So estradiol is critical for men too, but they get it from their testosterone into their heart and in their arteries. So what happens when you don't have enough nitric oxide, that also is a contributor to diastolic dysfunction in the female heart. So when you see diastolic dysfunction on an ultrasound, the echocardiogram of the heart for a woman, that is very important. It should be noted, and it is consistent with that there's an energy deficiency in the heart and as well a nitric oxide deficiency. Now, what can trigger as well a nitric oxide deficiency state is when you have a lot of inflammation, which is very common. That's what happens after menopause. Women have total body low-level inflammation that can damage that enzyme that I told you about. So even what is present, the enzyme isn't working properly because it goes through a process called uncoupling, which is due to oxidative stress, free radicals due to inflammation. Now, having estradiol around helps to quell inflammation. It regulates the immune cells and helps to prevent leaky gut and keeps inflammation at bay because estradiol turns on and off inflammation appropriately. Chronic low-level constant inflammation underlies the uncoupling of this vital enzyme, nitric oxide synthase, which then creates massive problems in the body, including in the arteries and in the heart. So it's really important to understand the difference in the heart in terms of the energy needs of women and what happens with the loss of estradiol. Now, what about the electrical conduction of the heart? That also is very reliant on estradiol. So with menopause, what happens is the autonomic nervous system. This is the part of the neurological system that controls everything we don't even think about, which includes heart rate, the heartbeat, and how frequent you're beating your heart. Well, when you go into menopause, the natural state, which is parasympathetic, which is controlled by the vagus nerve, becomes less functional because estradiol helps to create the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, which is what the vagus nerve uses to make its signaling. So you have less vagal tone, and you end up in a body that is more overloaded with sympathetic output, and sympathetic as in stress, stress as sympathetic. So when you're in a stress mode, the body does certain things, one of which is to create vasoconstriction. The artery starts to contract, gets narrower, that increases blood pressure, so you're more prone to hypertension after menopause. In fact, by age 65, women who are not on hormones, the incidence of hypertension, high blood pressure, is 75% by age 65. A lot of that is because of loss of nitric oxide production and an overwhelm of the sympathetic output of the autonomic nervous system, triggering more constriction of the arteries. So in addition, when you have more sympathetic stress output, you also end up increasing the heart rate. And women are very prone to different tachyarrhythmias, very rapid heartbeat. And that includes things like palpitations, and even it can go into atrial fibrillation, which is very common and a serious risk for stroke. So we're going to cover so much more in the future because this is a lot of information to absorb, I understand. So let me do a quick review. And in the future, I'll talk more about cholesterol and what happens, and we'll talk more about other vascular issues and so on. There's so much involved in the cardiovascular system. But for today, I want you to have these takeaways. Estradiol is critical for the creation of energy in the heart. The heart needs a lot of energy. When you're pregnant, you need to pump 50% plus more blood volume around the body, and that requires a lot of energy. And even when you're not pregnant, you need to be able to have a strong, functional heart with lots of energy. All of that requires estradiol. So estradiol helps to maintain energy production in the heart for all its needs by functional mitochondria support. So the mitochondria are the little structures that create energy, and through maintaining the production of energy, the maintenance and rejuvenation of mitochondria, and dealing with the byproducts of energy production, which are toxic, the superoxide, estradiol keeps the mitochondria working. And not just estradiol, but its metabolic byproduct, 2-methoxyestradiol, and there are even receptors that bind to something else ligand. We don't know what it is, but it doesn't work unless you have estradiol right there, and that's called estrogen-related receptors. You need nitric oxide in the arteries, you need it in the heart. That requires a functional enzyme, nitric oxide synthase, which requires estradiol, and without adequate estradiol, then you cannot have proper production of nitric oxide. So don't despair, okay? Number one, we can monitor and measure this through echocardiograms, through ultrasounds of the arteries, and through inflammation testing, and through a blood test called ADMA, which is an indirect surrogate marker of nitric oxide. When you have high ADMA, it is consistent with low nitric oxide. So we can monitor and measure, so we can know the status of your arteries and your heart through ultrasounds and blood tests. In addition, there's things we can do. There are supplements that can support mitochondria, like urolithin A products, like ubiquinol, the absorbable form of CoQ10, like NMN, precursor to NAD. NAD, which is a coenzyme that helps to create energy and run the mitochondria with the sirtuins. Okay, so it's very involved in creation of energy and mitochondrial function. And we have ways of helping the mitochondria to work better with the precursors of NAD called NMN, nicotinamide mononucleotide. So we have those as supplements. In addition, there are nitric oxide supplements that can help promote the production of nitric oxide. And of course, there's diet and exercise. Eating nitrate-containing vegetables, my personal favorites are beets and kale and bok choy and spinach. So those have nitrates, and we're going to talk another time about how you can turn nitrates into nitric oxide, and that's another way of increasing nitric oxide in your heart and in your arteries. Exercise is also great for mitochondrial rejuvenation and function. So don't think there's nothing we can do. And of course, bioidentical hormones are key as well. So monitoring and measuring the health of the arteries and the heart is important at every stage of life, but especially critically important when a woman is pregnant and we don't want complications, and then again, as women transition into menopause and spend the rest of their lives as a menopausal woman. So I know that's a lot of information, but I hope it helps you to understand why I do, and hopefully your doctor orders certain tests and makes recommendations so that you can have healthy arteries and a healthy heart and healthy longevity.